The Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live mostly everywhere. Hello, Nina. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
There's only so long that I can hold my fake smile for. This is how you start. This is a good test for understanding. I think anyone who does this gets to understand 19th century photography, where people had to sit.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So I have not started my stream here, but I'm starting now.
Yeah.
All right.
Very good. So my point is that this is how people, I think, can understand 19th century photography. Nice little digression in the beginning of the episode when, we look at those photographs and no one's really smiling. And the impression is that, wow, those were really serious, unhappy people. It's like, no, they had to sit for a few minutes and sit still without, movement as this image was being captured by using, by now outdated technology. So I kind of feel the same way. We're sitting here. Okay, we have to look kind of presentable. We don't want to look super scary. I know we're metalheads and stuff, but we don't want to be extremely terrifying, at least in this format. We can be terrifying elsewhere. Yeah, and then you're sitting with your fake smile and the music is playing. It's like, oh my God, how much longer can I hold a fake smile? But anyway, everyone, all millions of you, welcome to another fun-filled installment of the Winter Latina Show, where we're going to discuss large groups of pissed-off people trying to get their point across or trying to improve their living situation or get some kind of rights that they lack. So we're going to sort of dissect the anatomy of a protest, and we're going to look at different examples. So we will try, I know both of us, especially me, like to blab a lot, but we will try to make each of the examples brief. So sort of this is going to be the format for today. It's a little bit different than some of the maybe more detailed historic topics that we've done, but we are going to jump in history to look at a couple of historical protests. Now, of course, we know right now there is a massive anti-war movement with the Gaza protests happening. Arguably, some have said these are the biggest protests since the Iraq War protests. Nothing really like that has happened since, for various reasons, in the West. So we're not going to talk about them, but this is certainly something that, because it's in the news, has kind of inspired us to think about how some protests are grassroots, how other protests can be grassroots, but they can be hijacked and turned into color revolutions. What are some of the requirements for a successful protest? Have protests been successful, and to what extent? Now, of course, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not, tens of thousands of examples we can choose from. So we're going to really narrow this down. But first, we would like to focus for also a brief amount of time on the unfortunate 10th anniversary of the Odessa Massacre that happened on May 2nd, 2014. So we happen to be live streaming exactly on this anniversary, so it's kind of impossible to not mention it. And back in the day when I used to be invited on RT, I'm pretty sure I discussed this topic, and of course, as it just happened, it was really, obviously we're very, very far removed from it, but everyone was just in an absolute state of shock when something of that caliber happened. And I think at that time, Marcelo, you were not really tuned in, from what I remember, into the news. When did you first learn about the Odessa Massacre?
So, as I already mentioned here in the show before, I started to focus on what was happening in Ukraine. Well, of course, we heard about Crimea, and as living in the Western world, Crimea was always something that, the Russians invaded Crimea and all that stuff. And back at that time, I was not aware of much. Then I met, years later, I met one of my Russian friends that started to explain me some of the perspective from the Russian side, of course. I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong. Mm-hmm. Just, after a while, you just, okay, this makes more logic than the other side. But in any case, he started explaining to me, and okay, got it. And then when in February 2020, when Russia entered Ukraine again, 2022. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Very recently. My point is that
very recently, yeah.
Started looking into it quite recently.
My math always gets me because of the 2 years, of lockdowns and all that stuff.
Of course. Honestly, this 10 years feels like it hasn't passed, and I probably sound like a boomer now, but yeah, I mean, for those of us who have really been sort of focused on these events and following them pretty closely, it feels like, on the one hand, it feels like it happened a millennium ago. At the same time, it feels like it happened yesterday, because it obviously has been unresolved.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially for me, because, as I said, I learn better or more about the first Crimea situation in 2014 years later. So it was already some time that since it has started or happened.
Yeah.
And then in 2022, I started to learn, to search about what was going on in Ukraine. And the first thing that I saw was this documentary on Netflix, of course. Who's called Ukrainian Flames or something like that. I'm not sure. It's a very similar name as the one that
the Oliver Stone one. Yeah, I think
it's
kind of interesting.
But of course, in the Netflix, they brush a little bit over some situations and always portraying it very badly, like Odessa Massacre. Something bad happened there, but those guys were agitators and stuff like that.
Well, initially they claimed that the agitators, quote unquote, were Russian, and then of course eventually both the official Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian media, and the official Western media had to acknowledge that there were Ukrainian citizens, but then they just started calling them pro-Russians because they kind of had to double down on their idea. If they could make them into, agent provocateurs or some kind of fakes, basically, who were imported specifically to, start shit, pardon my French. But, then they kind of had to, okay, we're going to make, maybe lessen it a little bit. We're going to keep that same, trajectory of, well, they're not maybe Russian citizens, but they're pro-Russian. So definitely that would have been something that I'm sure popped up in this Ukrainian so-called documentary. Really kind of hard to call it a documentary.
Yeah, well,
but, why don't we just sort of briefly summarize what happened? So this was, so the Maidan, which some people call regime change, took place in February 2014, right? So this is now 4 months removed. And because a large segment of the population in Ukraine, primarily in the east, southeast, and sort of going toward the center of the country, was not happy with what happened, they perceived it as regime change right off the bat. It wasn't just, oh, we didn't get what we want. They realized this as an illegitimate toppling of a government, even if it's a government that, you'd say some people or many people disliked. There are other ways to handle the situation. And so there are massive protests all throughout the east, the southeast. And we briefly talked about this before. Basically, in the situation escalated maybe faster and more significantly in basically what became the Donbas republics. But in places like Kharkov, like Odessa, they were not quite as maybe significant from the standpoint of, capturing administration buildings, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are different ways that you can look at this. In some parts of Donbas, the cities got recaptured. We talked about Mariupol before, and we talked about Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, that were basically militarily recaptured or recaptured by the government before the situation could escalate to essentially war. So there are sort of all these pieces of the puzzle that may be a little bit different, but they're all part of the greater whole. And so Odessa is a very multicultural city because of its location on the Black Sea. It's not just people from the former Soviet Union, but also you would have, someone like Greeks, for instance, living there. So it has a long history, but at the same time, it's been culturally Russian and Russophone in terms of language, very, very definitively. And so obviously, the anti-Maidan sentiment in that city was pretty significant. And so you had those protests happening in Odessa, much like other cities in what then was the Ukrainian east and southeast. And on that particular day, there were, as the media describes, clashes between sort of more, we would call them ultra-nationalists. Obviously, it's sort of a crowd, right? So it's kind of difficult to paint everyone with the same brush. I'm sure some people on both sides had good intentions, but definitely some of these more radical people and soccer or football hooligans, they're kind of known for maybe not being the nicest people who like to party, some of whom like to be violent, right? So there was that segment of the population too. And the anti-Maidan protesters, some of them included, women, underage teenagers, children, etc. Now, some men too, of course. So it was quite diverse. And so as a result of these so-called clashes, the anti-Maidan protesters ended up in this trades union building. It has kind of different translations in English. And the radicals basically ended up trapping them inside by closing and locking all the doors. And Molotov cocktails were used to set the building on fire. So it was a very deliberate situation. And there's a ton of footage floating around with people, young girls actually, like they look like they're teenagers or maybe early 20s, wrapped in Ukrainian flags, making these Molotov cocktails. I mean, I still remember the footage. You could still find it. There's a bunch of it online still. And so it's interesting, this morning I tweeted out a clip that I found, and it was on a YouTube channel coming from a Western government-funded website. I don't want to say what it is because I don't want to promote them. And they kind of cropped the making of the cocktails, so you can't really tell who is making them. And so then the question is, well, isn't that interesting? Why are you cropping the full scene just to show the making of the cocktails? That's pretty convenient because there's all this other footage of these girls and some other people who have very, very distinct insignia and were easily identifiable in this sense. And so as a result of locking up and essentially using arson on this huge, huge building, a bunch of people got trapped inside. And so some people ended up dying from injuries from fire, smoke inhalation, which would be kind of a typical way, unfortunately, for someone to perish in this situation. But some people tried to escape. They started jumping out of windows, and then they were killed as they were caught leaving the building, even in such a crazy way. Obviously, they're injured on the way down. Other people were shot. And so there are other methods used to sort of crack down on them, not just this nice way of killing them. I'm sorry, I have another friend, a new friend that came to me yesterday to come join me. Hello, friend.
Jesus Christ, he's huge.
He's huge. You should see the rest of him. He's like a bus. Talk about a 6-month-old puppy.
Hey, you were talking about it 10 minutes before.
I know. When I said huge, I don't think you thought you knew. Like, I mean, huge.
I imagine a huge puppy, not a huge.
It's a huge
bear.
A huge. No, it's a bus. He looks like a bus if you were to see.
Bus.
But yes, he's also being brainwashed to be a evil Kremlin analyst.
Propagandist.
So now I have two. Yeah, now I have two canines who. I did this to myself, by the way. So, but anyway, let's not digress. This is sort of a happy distraction when we're talking about something terrible.
Animals are always welcome here in the channel.
Well, we kind of have no choice. they just show up until I train them better. But so. In addition to, I mean, this was a very clear case of murder, right? It's not just like, oh, well, the building was accidentally set on fire and some people got trapped in it. We don't know how it happened, right? Oh, someone accidentally threw this Molotov cocktail in this direction, but it landed in this direction. When you're actually going after people who are trying to escape a building that is on fire and you're essentially, finishing them off, there's really... no words to describe the thinking that would go into that. And so the official death toll was 48. So 6 people died in the so-called clashes. 42 people, again, according to official Ukrainian records, died in this building. But of course, unofficial death tolls that we've seen, both coming from Ukraine, from Russia, and from sort of other investigations that call themselves independent, it's surpasses 100. And then there are also approximately 200, 250 injuries. Again, you can, take this number with a grain of salt. Not that 48 is any better than 116, but kind of just keep this in mind. So there might have been minimizing going on as well. And so, like we just said initially, the government blamed these agent provocateurs. They're coming from Russia, and of course, eventually they had to admit that these were all citizens of Ukraine, and in fact, local residents, some of whom have lived their entire life in Odessa. And at that point, sort of the official West and the Ukrainian government had to sort of back down a little bit, not in the sense of, oh, well, it might be our fault. But it's like, well, the firefighters didn't do a good enough job to put out the fire. And so they kind of started blaming these external factors instead of really focusing on the absolute inhuman attitude that the perpetrators had toward people whom they opposed politically. Again, it's very difficult to even, it wasn't like, it's not a war where you're a soldier and you have to shoot someone. This is someone who is your neighbor, who lives in your city, but happens to oppose certain politics. And again, you and I and everyone in the world probably has someone whose politics they really, really don't like. But we're probably not fantasizing of doing something like that.
Yep.
Which is the level of sadism is something else here, right? So on the scale as well.
When I see this, what I perceive is that really, I mean, you may have Brazil right now, for example. You're going to have a completely divided country in terms of politics. I mean, you have the last, 3 elections, we saw that we have a winner that's more a loser than, it's less loser than the other side.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, very close.
You have 50-50. And those 50-50 are not even the entire spectrum of the population.
Yeah, it might be like 20 to 30% of people, like
20 to 30%
in Europe. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, we fear some drastic movements in the politics in the near future, and we have seen some very bad situations in Brazil, but a little bit more punctual, more isolated.
I see.
But in any case, this is something that you clearly see that a vast, I will not say a vast majority, but a huge sum of the population was completely against what was happening, in this isolated movement in Kiev. Well, it was very big. Well, just the other day, I'm getting to the point. The other day, we saw what happened in Brazil with Bolsonaro having this demonstration with 700,000 people. That is 220 million Brazilians.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's always good to put this in perspective, even if the show of force is quite large. I can go back to the sort of these pro-Western liberals that like to protest, let's say, Moscow, and sometimes not anymore, because they sort of reveal their true faces with let's sanction our country, let's hurt our own citizens, their bio garbage and all this other terminology that you use. We talked about this earlier, but they used to have more of a support maybe in 2011, 2012, 2013, sort of that protest wave. And yeah, there would be like tens of thousands of people, but this is first of all Moscow. It's a very particular urban environment. But when you look at the population that surpasses 145 million people, that is a drop in the ocean, right? So we always have to look for context and scale as well, which is not to say that it's completely insignificant. I mean, obviously, large numbers of people showed up, but they're sort of coming from a particular demographic. Yeah, so I think it's important to mention. But specifically here with Odessa, these radical elements were unleashed with the Maidan, which started off, you could say it had some grassroots level type things happening where they were legitimate, where people had certain grievances toward the Yanukovych government or the government of Ukraine at large, its direction, right? So again, none of these color revolutionary scenarios happen completely in a vacuum. But of course, you can find problems in any country, even a country that is better off than Ukraine was in 2013, 2014. You just kind of have to look for it. You can find some kind of social division. It could be different in every different society, but you can find it. And so, yes, and then of course it turned into, again, what many people call regime change today, but it was these enforcers, these, you can call them street gangs, you can call them stormtroopers, you can call them, street soldiers, whatever, these radical elements that were essentially emboldened because nothing happened to them when they were perpetrating all kinds of violence against, well, first it was the police, the state, and you could say, well, it's okay, they're, opposing the state, but it was also against their fellow citizens who were unarmed. And when you unleash that kind of power, that kind of force, and they're sort of like the people who brought you to power, it's kind of hard to crack down on them afterwards because they've learned how to organize. Possibly they have some funding coming from the outside, but even if they do not, they're now well organized. And they also know they have carte blanche to do whatever the hell they want. And so this was the situation in Odessa, right? These people thought, we can do whatever we want. We're going to get away with it. And ultimately they did, because really no justice was served now, 10 years later. But I think that's a really kind of important point of what happens in these situations when you rely on the sort of street level enforcers, right? So, but basically sort of the grand picture of the Odessa massacre is, we talked about this before as well, why did the protest wave die down in the east? Why did it keep going in Donetsk and Lugansk republics? Why did it die down in the east? And it's
about to ask you that.
It's because of cases like this. When you see that not only can you be murdered in such a, again, just unbelievable way, but you're also not going to have any justice, and the people who did it or people who supported them are essentially running around and doing whatever they want. And what possible conclusion are you going to draw from that? Most people, yes, some people are very, very ideological, are going to continue fighting. And we know that those who continued fighting often ended up in prisons run, or jails, or whatever you want to call them, run by the Ukraine security services as SBU, right? SBU. I don't know what the Americans call it. SBU, right? So, SBU is what we would call it. Yeah, so this is where a lot of them ended up. Some of them have been in prison for years. They've had multiple injuries from being, when you're a political prisoner, you essentially don't have the civil rights that you would have if you were a, run-of-the-mill criminal, especially in a very politically tense situation. So this is what happened to people who kept fighting. So when you have sort of like, okay, people who fought initially, many of them are dead in a very, very demonstrative way. Like, it's not just they were, hurt in some apartment somewhere. It was a spectacle. It was, some people could say it was designed to be a spectacle. You can kind of draw your own conclusions, but it's definitely, dying from a fire or a fire-related death is probably one of the worst nightmares that any human would have. And when you see that, and it's a mass spectacle, and we're living in the 21st century where everything is online and everything is happening in real time, it really leaves an impact on you, even if you're way far removed from that. So now imagine living in the city, you are in this political situation and you hold certain political views. Many people would just stop. They would just decide to be quiet. People stay quiet for smaller reasons. Like, I don't want to be fired from my job. I don't want to be disliked by my neighbors because I have politics that are a little bit different on such and such issue. But here you have this scale of an event. So this is, go ahead.
I guess that was more or less the theory of hanging people in public places back on the days.
Of course, any kind of public execution to dissuade people from participating in whatever they were participating in. So, and again, we can go back, like I said, in some cases, the protest wave was crushed, like in Mariupol, before the war really got there. We talked about videos of tanks getting there. In other places like Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, there was war going on, and those places were hopefully temporarily, in my opinion, reconquered by Kiev. And so, there are sort of all these different things that happen in different places, but specifically in Odessa, where the war that was going on in Donbass, it was sort of heating up, but it wasn't quite as bad as it turned, in the summer of 2014. You basically saw what would happen to you if you dare to continue participating in these. And it was definitely something that reduced and in some cases fully removed the protest wave in that part of Ukraine in 2014. And so in that sense, it worked for the government, for some of these radical forces, for their Western backers. I mean, you can read it in many different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and so and I guess and I might be mistaken there. Also, the Donbass militia, let's call it militia, was formed actually from former army and intelligence officers, also from the SBU, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think some of them definitely did flee. There's sort of like a little bit of, obviously, again, not when you say lots of people did not agree with this regime change. That applies to people in every part of society, and some of them would have been, ex-military or ex-intelligence. So definitely that element was there too. But most of them, as far as I can tell, are just ordinary people that found themselves in a particular situation and had no choice. So but some of them definitely did too.
About what to say of the Molotov cocktails, I remember in 2022, there was this congressman, this deputy from Brazil, that he actually lost his mandate, or he resigned in the end, because he went to Ukraine. This very right-wing, let's call it right-wing, it's not right-wing, it's just, sponsored by someone that maybe, who knows. He went to Ukraine, and then he ended up, he went to Ukraine to help people making Molotov cocktails. And he bragged himself, I'm helping making Molotov cocktails. And this is a congressman, a deputy.
So this was 2014 or more recently?
That's 2022. That's the new
era. Wave. Okay, I see.
One. Yeah. Sure. And and he ended up resigning or losing his mandate because some WhatsApp conversations ended up leaking, where he was being extremely disrespectful about Ukrainian women. So, I'm not gonna say what he said, but it was a low standard speaking, and very depreciative. And I just wanted to point this out so people outside understand that this guy does not represent Brazil, one. Okay, and he represents a type of people that is paid to do this type of propaganda.
He just sounds. I'm sorry. He just sounds like a higher level sex tourist. I mean, that's essentially what he sounds like. I mean, he's just in a nice suit. I mean, So let's just put it right out there.
But you know that this tour was sponsored by someone. So this guy would go there to say, I'm helping Ukraine. Right. Yeah.
He's helping by texting on WhatsApp.
Yeah, exactly. He's not in the politics anymore now.
He's not in politics as well.
Gone for life.
Sure. Although sometimes these sorts of things are being used against people that may not deserve it, right? There's the other side of the coin too. But I would like to get into sort of, now that we talked about a protest that failed because of extreme government crackdown, but also sort of these street elements that were, again, you can say they were acting not officially, but in the name of the new regime, right? They're sort of enforcing. Go ahead.
Just before we move the direction, I have one question here. That is, you have one protest that failed, and that is the Odessa one, and you have at the same time the one that worked. pretty well. That was the Kiev one, the Euromaidan. Because okay, it's two things very different. I'm not putting one next to another, but the two ones, you have a lot of people unsatisfied with the movements of the country, and we cannot, as you say, you cannot ignore the people that just saw this on Facebook and say, "Oh, I'm also unsatisfied, and I'm going there, and I'm going to be part of that." People that sincerely believe that could do a change, and both of
or
the
people who are just very naive.
Very naive, exactly. I'm talking about naiveness. People that just this is the way. They believe that was the way. So in both cases, you have a very special point to be made, that both cases had a extremely high level of violence over the people, and one worked to its needs,
to carry out regime change. Yes,
to carry out regime change, and even naively, people wanted that. People that was supporting that wanted the regime change at some point. And the other one, was tuned down by this, of course. I think your point is perfect. People just say, okay, I have better things to do. I have a family.
Yeah, I prefer not to be burned alive while I'm trapped in a building, and then I'm
How do you see the why one worked? I think that the answer is quite clear, but how do you see why one worked and the other one was successfully tuned down?
Well, the key of Maidan, right? This was sort of a combination of initially a certain level of grassroots sentiment, like you mentioned, but obviously it had lots and lots of outside help, which is why we can call it a color revolution. Ukraine had a previous attempt at a color revolution called literally the Orange Revolution. This is why they're called color revolutions. They all had colors. In 2004, it didn't quite work, but it had roots in all of these NGOs that have been there for, since the 90s, some of them since the early 2000s. They had a ton of money being pumped into them coming from various institutions and governments in the official West. And of course, we know what NGOs are used for. They're used to shape public opinion, to form so-called independent media. But of course, it's independent of the government of that country, but it's dependent on the funding coming from the outside. I just love how they use the term independent media, and then it says funded by the European Commission. It's like, well, clearly it's dependent on the funding of the European Commission. So do not call it independent media. You could say it's independent of whatever government.
So like, share, subscribe, and if you want to follow our work, all the links on the description. And I just wanted to
truly independent, not funded by the European Commission.
Not funded.
Yeah, but it's and so basically you kind of had years and years of fostering this so-called civil society that was dependent on the funding coming from outside sources, from the official West. And again, you could say some of those people might have been true believers. Other people were opportunists because they're being paid well. Who knows at this stage? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter if they're 60% true believer and 40% funded. You know what I'm saying? It could be, it could be like one person as well who is like, well, I'm like this, but I'm also a little bit like that. So and so basically you had this really fertile soil that was created for changing a government and making Ukraine not this country that's sort of sitting in between the East and the West, again, using these terms very, very roughly and very generally, between Russia and the European Union. But Ukraine was basically forced to basically choose one direction, and as it chose quote unquote one direction, it had to reject the other. It wasn't just a choice. I'm turning this way, and I'm now going to work more with the European Union, but I still have all of my industry tied up and all the family ties, et cetera, culture tied up with Russia. I'm just going to completely reject that. And of course, this is where the idea of a negative identity comes in a way of promoting this new direction that's not really new, but it's definitely a point where it became this watershed moment in 2013, 2014. So yeah, at this stage, it's a protest that did have some grassroots legitimacy, but ultimately it was hijacked as a color revolution. And I also want to differentiate, because then it's a little bit of a tricky situation where some people would say, well, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was also a color revolution because such and such revolutionary may have had funding coming from e.g. Britain or e.g. Germany. And the problem I have with that is that these people may have had some kind of, obviously, well, of course, there's going to be interest from foreign countries like, hello, welcome to the world, like, were you born yesterday? But the issue here is that these revolutionaries were writing highly intellectual, theoretic works for decades. They were, suffering in prisons of the sort of late imperial Russia. So they're definitely ideological with or without this funding that they may or may not have received for decades. And the level of intellectual work, the intellectual rigor coming from, Lenin and friends, regardless of what you think of him, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is in no way comparable to anything that would happen in any of these, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution, or the Maidan in Ukraine. You do not have intellectuals who have been working for decades and producing things at that level. So this is where I would draw one distinction in terms of the ideological sort of dedication to their cause. Again, whether you absolutely hate them and think they're absolute scum, or whether you think they created a more egalitarian society after a couple of decades of violence, let's say in the Soviet Union, it doesn't matter. I think the ideological dedication, intellectual rigor, and dedication over time are sort of the things that show you that this is a real revolutionary scenario, regardless of what you think of it, as compared to some of these NGOs that may have, hired someone out of college. They've graduated 2 years ago and now they're promoting this and that. It's just not a comparable situation at all. And so this is, again, I know it can be a little bit of a gray area thinking of historic revolutionary scenarios, but I think it's important to differentiate between the two.
I think that's a very extremely important point and an extremely difficult point to analyze. And perhaps it can only be analyzed in future, after happens and you see the consequences. But, one thing that because all of these movements, and we were discussing this before, I had very few, I had no large historical knowledge of Brazil itself. So I have the normal school, what's it called, the high school level,
like
education,
regular public education,
and that's it. And even like that, I'm learning nowadays that the history that I learned was mostly wrong. Was mostly told the wrong way, at least. Let's put it like that. Not all of it, but a good part of it.
Well, maybe the facts were sort of, the dates and the names were there, but the interpretation might have been a little bit off.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Like the D-Day was the dividing moment of World War II, things like that.
Yeah.
So one thing that I was mentioning, we had a huge protests in 1992, if I'm not mistaken, 92, 93, which was called the Painted Faces, with people that painted yellow and green on their faces, which are the color of Brazilian flag, the green and yellow, and it was called the Painted Faces. And at that moment, it ended up with the impeachment of the current president at the time, that was Fernando Collor, and his name was Collor. No kidding.
I know, right?
And
one of the early examples.
Yeah, he was the president, and he ended up being impeached and removed from presidency. And at that time, that all seemed very organic. And still today, we talk about, we always analyze that, okay, so the people went to the streets, it gave the temperature for the politicians that decide, okay, we can go on with removing this guy, and because people will support this removal. And that was our thinking back at the time. Right now, when I see this, most of those student leaders, quote unquote, call them like that, they end up on the politics, and you see the bias that they took on the politics. You have very good examples. I'm not going to mention them now because they are still in politics. I can get in trouble. But you have good examples of people that, they were revolutionary leaders and they just became, an asset for foreign powers at the end. And so that was the moment. One thing that I try to understand now when I see such types of movement is the type of anthem that they are calling for. What
are their demands?
What are the demands? It's very hard because most of the demands are legitimate. They were legitimate in that case that I just mentioned.
Of course, yeah.
But at the same time, you have to understand, okay, why is this happening now?
Yeah.
And I think all these measures you have to take at the moment. We had more recently than that, we had the same thing with Dilma Rousseff, who was president of Brazil, and we had then you start to see something different, like you have the black blocs. I don't know if they call like that as well in the United States. No, just agitators.
Yeah,
Masked
I understand
agitators.
what you mean. No, I don't think this was used in North America, but I get what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, masked agitators, the special guy that goes there, everybody's there. Yeah, people are pissed off. And those guys just started, throwing rocks or pushing people around inside the protest, so people get more agitated and end up doing stupid stuff. So this case was slightly more obvious, the situation. Yeah, of course, you need the country to be in a bad shape, or not terrible shape, but bad shape. But how do you think it's possible on the present time of something like that happening to identify that this is a movement that we are not supposed to be having?
Well, I think it's difficult because you have a lot of, it's almost like social media is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have the just sheer unprecedented amount of information that we've never had before, with people filming from their phones and, dumping it for you to see. And then you could sort of kind of maybe engage in your own analysis, although you don't know what's being cropped out, sort of like the typical question of photography. It's documentary, but it's also like, what angle is it presented from? What is being not shown? Etc. So yeah, but you also have a lot of, again, I hate to use the term conspiracy theory because sometimes conspiracy theories, quote unquote, are completely legitimate, but sometimes they're insane. And so you also have a lot of this sort of thing floating around with, well, they might be funded by, this billionaire philanthropist, we all know who he is, or they might be funded by foreign countries. And then politicians in, let's say, that particular country would jump on the idea and sort of use it for their own political gains, right? So to do some kind of fundraising or to achieve something in, their parliament, whatever. I'm speaking very generally right now. So I think it's not easy to definitively identify these things until maybe it's over and we have a little bit of time to reflect on it. But you also can ask questions of, whom does this benefit? Whom does this not benefit? What is this type of politician who is sort of, supports this type of politics, like the politician that is, very pro-war, again, speaking very generally. What does this type of politician say? And so you can kind of piece things together by doing that kind of investigative analysis, by looking at public information. And I think, again, cui bono, right? Whom does this benefit is a very good question. And so, again, you have to be really careful, and you also have to be very careful to not be completely blinded by your own, confirmation bias, your own ideological views, etc. So, I think we may also be susceptible to it. But I think the scale of the current anti-war protest in North America and in Europe is, again, it's unprecedented compared to the last 2 decades of that particular idea of because we've had other wars, right? We've had wars since the massive Iraq protests. So I think you have to ask yourself, what is it that triggered something on that scale? And I think when you look at what's been going on in Gaza, I mean, I think the answer is pretty obvious what triggered it. And to pin it on some foreign power, funding it or not funding it, or one guy, it becomes a little bit iffy. But we're not gonna focus on this one because it remains to be seen. It's one of those. It's in progress. It remains to be seen, and we can sort of think about it later. But what I do want to look at is, we called it the anatomy of a protest, and sort of just some basic characteristics, right? So usually when people protest, it's because they are unhappy with something, right? It could be in the past. It could be, in some countries we have those. It could be a general strike because people are very unhappy with their labor conditions, with their pay, with the safety at their work, right? There's multiple historic precedents in every industrialist country as it was being industrialized, because you had the state of wild capitalism, and naturally people would protest, trying to unionize, trying to sort of gain additional rights. We had kind of more specific attempts to gain rights for different groups of people, right? It could be the suffragettes fighting for women's rights. It could be sort of more generic civil rights. And it could be obviously, anti-war type scenarios. And then we have the situation that has the possibility of turning into a revolution or a regime change, right? It's much, much more general dissatisfaction with the absolute state of affairs, right? With the government, with the direction of the country, et cetera. So we kind of have general public dissatisfaction necessary for maybe a more niche protest, but also definitely a more generic protest. Now, of course, we need a certain level of organization, right? We need some kind of leadership. Without it, it's basically a mob, and the mob is dangerous. So, I don't care if I even agree with whatever the mob is demanding. The mob is dangerous, and it can turn very dangerous for anyone, right? So we definitely need some kind of leadership for people who are protesting, right? You can look historically at that. You can look at, protests from 20 years ago. You can look at protests today. So we obviously need some kind of a goal or a purpose, right? And it has to be pretty explicitly stated. Like, what are these people demanding, right? Is it pressure on the government to change some kind of a policy, or on a corporation, let's say, that's not allowing someone to unionize, again, to use kind of a more benign example, or to change some particular situation. So let's say in anti-war protests, now they're of course generically anti-war, but usually there is a particular situation that is unfolding, a particular military conflict, right, that it has triggered this kind of a demonstration, right, ongoing demonstration. And so now we get to the response of the state. Now we live in the 21st century, where many states claim to be nominally democratic, right? And in such societies, we have the idea that a civil society has the right to express itself. It has the right to demand things to be better, ask the government to do better, ask the corporations, the employers to do better, and all of these nice sounding things, right? So technically, we have this idea. Now, the extent to which each particular state that claims to be democratic, including the official West that claims to be, the most civilized bringer of light of all, remains to be seen. And so the problem here is that when the state, and it doesn't matter what the state is like in terms of a political system, feels threatened, this is when it's going to crack down. It may feel threatened because its very nature is being threatened, like it feels like it's going to be overthrown, the state, right? Or it can be something maybe less significant, but perceived as very damaging to the state, maybe to the ideology of the state, the idea of the state, the funding of the state, something that is very crucial, but maybe not the overall nature of the state. And at that point, even the nicest governments that claim to be democratic, they get very, very concerned, because like no state, doesn't matter if it's Russia, China, Canada, whatever, Germany, like that is the definition of the state. Like, what is a state? The state is an entity that has the monopoly on violence, right? This is why the state that has police and the military, like very, very basic politics here. And so at a point when the state feels threatened, this is when we kind of have a real test, right, of these protests. And so I think what we're seeing today in the crackdowns, let's say, and I think from what I understand in parts of Europe, the Gaza protests have been made illegal, right? Am I understanding correctly? I haven't been following it in particular European countries.
I'm not sure illegal, but
very bad consequences can be had in terms of like fines. And I'm not sure if there's like a criminal offense attached to them, maybe in Germany. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I was very cursory reading because I wasn't going to talk about the subject. But yeah, so basically, this is the real test, right? So in a more authoritarian government, there's really no mask where, yeah, you're challenging us, we're going to crack down on you. And this is going to be my next example, the 1905 failed revolution in Russia, right? This is an autocratic state. This is the late Russian Empire, right? This is the Tsar. So there is no pretense that we're going to let you guys do what you want. We're going to let you demand rights. We're going to crack down on you because you're challenging our authority, right? But it's more of an issue in these states that are nominally democratic because they want to be perceived in this way. They use it for propaganda against other states that are perceived to be less democratic, right? Well, we have free speech and we have this and we have that and we have democracy and we have elections every 4 years, even though nothing changes. Oops, we shouldn't mention that part out loud. But yeah, so I know, it's a well-kept secret. No one can figure this one out. But yeah, this is when the state is threatened in either a big way or maybe a smaller way, but a crucial way. This is when the state starts cracking down and finding ways to basically either minimize the protesting or to completely just crack down on them. And it might be by using, like you talked about, you talked about black blocs, right? It might be someone who is going to cause provocations, and then there's violence, and then there is a criminal way to deal with it. Like, well, we have laws. We have a law for law and order. Of course, we're going to arrest these people, even though these people had no intention in engaging in criminality, right? Until that situation arose. So you have other, the state has different ways in dealing with the situation. Of course, you have the propaganda organs, right? As you would have called them in sort of a more authoritarian society. I still think they're propaganda organs. So you can, be trashing protesters in multiple ways if the state wants to minimize them, but still be perceived as, democratic. And yes, of course, we're allowing them to express their opinion. So I would generally say these are sort of, we can kind of go into more detail here, but these are sort of the general prerequisites. And whether or not it's successful, I mean, it really is case specific. And there is still debate about certain events that took place, 60 years ago, 100 years ago. We can go back, we can pull a Putin, go back in history even further, and there's still going to be debate as to the level of success certain protests have had, right? So if we go into the reason I mentioned the 1905 revolution, right? We call it the failed revolution. And it's an interesting case because it's a failed revolution, but it was a precedent that led to a successful revolution. So there's also this little trick, right? There's this thing that could happen where the initial failure can lead to success later on, which, in this case, it happened 12 years later. It might be, the timeline may be different in different situations. But basically, in the early 20th century, Russia was still a predominantly agricultural society, but it was industrializing. It was industrializing later than Western European countries, which is, of course, why even today Western European countries love to call themselves civilizationally superior, because Russia was not quite on the same timeline. It's hilarious. But the level of industrialization was significant in large cities, right? Moscow, St. Petersburg, et cetera, et cetera. At this time, St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia. And of course, when a country is industrializing, as we've seen from, the reason why Marx even started writing things, he saw wild capitalism, right? And he was very, very critical of it on the spot, right? Where we can leave out his theories of society and revolution. He was very critical of the relationship, right, between what he called the working class and the, you can call it the oligarchy, you can call it the, people who control the money, people who possess the means of production, whatever, right? So this was sort of the initial impetus for someone like Marx to engage in that level of societal and economic analysis. And so with wild capitalism, of course, you had very dangerous workplaces, you had child labor, right? You had chemicals, you had all that kind of fun stuff, you had insane work hours. So all the things that, we take for granted today with, the official 8-hour workday, which exists in some places, which is now being avoided by using, contractor work, et cetera, We're sort of going back to the good old days. Big air quotes in this sense, but that's a separate topic. Yeah, so naturally you had, labor protests in other countries. And so here is where they started hitting Russia. On top of that, we talked about this before, there was different kinds of social unrest and revolutionary sentiment in kind of more extreme organizations. They had different names. You had, social revolutionaries, you had the anarchists, you had the nihilists, you had People's Will in the late 19th century. Some of them engaged in actual assassinations, right, in actual extreme criminal acts. Many of them were just student intellectuals, again, a very diverse environment. But you sort of had this state of unrest, right, in Russian society in the late 19th, early 20th century. And one of the ways in which it culminated was the so-called Bloody Sunday of 1905 in January 1905. And it happened in St. Petersburg. And the grievances were very, very typical, right? The Russo-Japanese War was going on. So, of course, these people had certain anti-war demands. They were demanding fairer wages, right? This is sort of the industrial working class of St. Petersburg, better working conditions, reducing a workday to a more reasonable time. So the kinds of things we sort of, when we read about labor history, that's very, very standard in this sense. It had leaders. One of the leaders, I will mention him, he is a priest whose last name was Gapon, and he was later revealed to possibly have had links to be an informant for the police, right? So he was kind of a sketchy leader in that sense. But basically, this protest was well organized. But at this time, the people still perceived the Tsar, even though they were very unhappy with their working conditions, they still perceived the Tsar as sort of like the father of the state. So they wanted to bring a very respectful petition to the Tsar. And hopefully, again, like this one man, as God, right, can resolve all our problems. But instead, this situation escalated and they were shot upon by the Imperial Guard. And the death toll ranges widely, right? The official estimates coming from the Tsarist government was in the dozens. The estimates coming from the actual protesters was like in the thousands. So I think somewhere in the middle, right, we can say maybe hundreds of deaths. I think it could be like, let's say 150 or so. Injuries, obviously, much more significant, and of course, thousands of arrests. And having this kind of a violent crackdown obviously inspired other labor movements in Russia, other protests. And the Tsar responded in this kind of wishy-washy way. At first, he was sort of, I always say that, you could say that Nicholas's story may be tragic because his family was taken out as a result of the Russian Revolution, but he was really just not fit to be a ruler. I've always perceived him as a very weak Tsar. This is one of the examples.
Yeah,
where
I think
he
we discussed this here in the channel as well. Like,
I think we did mention him earlier.
The vacuum of power from the
exactly,
Tsar.
and so he really didn't deal with this in a way that would have really,
Smartly.
And maybe it was not possible to resolve the situation without making some really tectonic changes. But yeah, basically, he eventually ended up installing a sort of the Russian parliament that was supposed to represent different factions politically, sort of to maybe reduce the level of autocracy in the late Russian Empire. That was sort of the official goal. But nonetheless, these events and the events that were sort of precipitated by the Bloody Sunday of 1905, there were, thousands of arrests, et cetera, et cetera. So the crackdown of the state was very, very significant. And I think in this way, you could say that some members of, if there was such a thing as an organized working class in early 20th century Russia, then they were just very disappointed in the Tsar that they perceived in a positive light, even though they were very dissatisfied with their life and their working conditions. So some historians would make the argument that the failed revolution of 1905 eventually precipitated, and led to the successful second revolution, right? There were two in 1917, in the fall of 1917. And in fact, the number of strikes and protests in large Russian cities really increased in 1912, 1913, and going into sort of World War I. So there was definitely that trend that was happening. So we could say that in the immediate aftermath, the protest was a failure, right? They didn't really get not only did they not get what they wanted, but A, people died, unarmed people, right? B, many people were arrested. And in terms of working conditions, much like other countries that were industrializing, it was very case specific. You could have a factory owner that was really nice to his employees. He would have a daycare for let's say women who were working there. But then someone else was really terrible to them, right? So there was no federal oversight in terms of there was no law, right? The kinds of things that we have today. So I think this the reason I'm using this example, not only it's sort of a historic example from 120 years ago almost, but also it's a clear case where the state very clearly cracks down on these protesters without much pretense of yes, of course you can express your opinion, right? So this is an example of where there's really no, again, a little bit, we might launch the state parliament, we might launch the Duma, but in terms of actually dealing with the situation, no, we're just gonna, arrest a bunch of people after a bunch of people were shot, right? So what is your opinion on this example?
Well, yeah. So when it comes to this example, and I will make a parallel to probably all examples that we can bring up to this, I think there's always someone behind it, the sponsor. And sometimes it fulfill its needs, the sponsor's will, and sometimes it just change into something unexpected, and that's basically what we saw in the late years, in the last 20-30 years. You see just things going on ways that were not supposed to go for the sponsor, I would say.
Right.
So,
but wouldn't you say the 1905 case sounds like it was pretty grassroots in terms of having people who were legitimately pissed off at
exactly.
what their life was like?
So what my point is here is that there's always this legitimacy on people's misery. So at that point, people, as you said, as you correctly mentioned, the any beginning of industrial revolution anywhere, it's something very rough. People working as many hours as possible.
Yeah, I mean, Karl Marx literally uses the term misery, right, to use it as an ideological concept, exactly as you said.
Exactly. So you're going to see people in a miserable life without any work, any decent work condition, dying, children working with coal or stuff like that, mining coal, stuff like that. So you're gonna see an unrest on the people, unsatisfaction on that, and at the same time, someone is gonna pick this unsatisfaction, which is legitimate, and it's going to sponsor it. It's going to pump money or pump news or pump agitators, as you wish, to bring this to I would imagine, with my vast ignorance, that the British, for example, would have a big part of participation in the Russian Revolution, but
But this was my point: is that it doesn't ultimately matter whether let's say Lenin went to Germany or the London funded a revolutionary, because there was such a mass level of social discontent that it would have happened anyway. And these, in my opinion, and these this is why I mentioned these very sort of specific 1912 protests, 1913 protests, where it was happening without any sort of outside evil, foreign power coming in and making them happen, right? So, and of course, obviously, World War I made things significantly worse in terms of the working conditions, standard of living, and just basically death and destruction, right? So I would say it would have happened anyway. And then I think, again, like I mentioned, these intellectuals that have had this track record of writing very particular high-level works for decades, they would have done it with or without the funding, again, in my opinion. And so I think this is, again, an interesting example where it's hard to say, even in hindsight, whether there was a chance to resolve it in 1905. But this is a case where a protest was crushed, but it led to not only a bigger protest, but it led to a complete toppling of power that crushed the initial protest, right? It led to a revolution, and there was no going back. So in terms of its success, right, again, going back to this question, it was a failure in the initial aftermath, but it was a success because ultimately, for better or for worse, right, they toppled this autocratic government. And, again, I'm one of these people, just to clarify, that I know there's some people who are just absolutely idealize the Russian Empire. Oh, the Tsars are so European, blah, 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 so sophisticated. And then they really look down on the Soviet Union. And there are other people who are like, oh, the Soviet Union and gave equality to everyone. The Tsars absolutely sucked, right? They sort of hoarded all the money. And I think again, you kind of have to look at things in a very factual way, and you could say there are benefits and drawbacks to each of these types of government. You could sort of look at specifically at what they are. It's way beyond the scope of this discussion, and so I'm not just completely trashing the imperial period in Russia. It had many great points, but
I guess I think just.
It's just, I know there's always going to be someone like, I can't believe you are a communist, or I can't believe you're this. It's like every episode.
Well, the other day someone wrote that I'm
ideology
too
changes.
Liberal.
Yeah, you're too liberal. You're too much of a neoliberal. Even worse, not just a liberal, a neoliberal. That's like a real insult.
I don't even know what that means.
Well, it just means you're a supporter of neoliberal economics, which I don't know how, but I know.
Well, people probably really know me better than
they know
better than myself.
But yes, you know what I mean. So I just kind of wanted to make this little disclaimer of I'm not just there are many good things about the late Russian Empire. This was not one of them, right? We could say there are many good things about the Soviet Union. There are some things that were not good. Like it's completely legitimate to look at history as usually these days some people like to look at it ideologically, and they completely discount an entire historic period because they don't like what the form of government was there, rather than actually looking at facts. And so that's why I like to look at facts. And so again, I'm not trashing the entire imperial Russia for those of you who like that period, but this particular situation was handled awfully. And it demonstrated that Nicholas was a very weak Tsar. But I think so when you have that challenge to the state, if the state doesn't resolve it in a reasonable way, this Russian case scenario shows that the state may be in greater danger because this thing has not been resolved, and it's very serious, right? It's like this ulcer or this cancer that's growing. Exactly. And I don't want to compare the work. I'm using like really bad analogies. I don't want to say it's a cancer in the view of the state, right? Not that the working class movement was the cancer, right? It was a good thing, but you know what I'm saying? From the point of view of the state, it did not resolve it, and this thing grew, and then it was unmanageable for the state. Yeah.
Exactly. So I just would like to make a point here. We had a conversation here in the channel with Chinese people, for example, Carl Jha and Jingjing Li, and also Brazilians that are living, Angelo Giuliano also living in Hong Kong. So most of them agree in the view that, for example, the Chinese people sees the president, the figure of Xi Jinping at this moment, as some kind of dynasty, some kind of emperor, and not that they miss the imperial time, the emperor times. It's just that I believe what they mean by that is that they perceive in that person, that one person or that figure, a leader. And I think that's the big caveat here. When you have, you're going to have people that have nostalgia over monarchy. You're going to have people that have nostalgia in Brazil, for example, on the military regime. And
I have nostalgia for the military regime that used to arrest people. Yeah, no, so it just sounds kind of funny.
And they have a very good reason for that, because there were times on political stability. There were. I'm not saying that the monarchy ended in Brazil on the late 19th century. So back there, the life was not very good, and just a couple of years before we had ended slavery. So it's not a very good time in Brazil, but for that period of time, Brazil was a strong power. Extremely strong power. It has a stable political system, and then it became a republic. We saw a lot of instability at the beginning. So people from this period would say, well, that time it was probably better.
Yeah, no, I
and then
understand.
after that, you have the military, who brought again a bit of stability. A million reasons to say, oh, that was not a good thing. But at that point, it was a stable system. And when it collapses in 84, if I'm not mistaken, in Brazil, after that, we had 2 impeached presidents, one jailed president, we had Bolsonaro. So our country that had a trajectory became a completely mess, and the reason, and what you see today is the country going back to difficult times, with money that was worth a lot of money a couple of years ago being extremely devalued. You have a country that doesn't go nor to the left nor to the right, just stay stalled. And so I think that was the perception. That is the point when people that has this kind of nostalgia of monarchy.
I understand.
Whatever.
Like when you made this example with China, it's kind of like, roughly speaking, it's the way people perceived Putin. It's not like they want necessarily a Tsar. Obviously, they want a strong leader, but there's also this perception like a Tsar, where, like Putin has those annual phone calls where people call in and write messages, and it's all televised. And some of it is pre-screened, but some of it isn't, right? So he definitely allows hostile questions, which, you would never see Western leaders allowing hostile questions on live broadcast. But the reason these things are so popular is because many people perceive him like, he is the one man who can solve my problem. And it may be some little municipal problem in their city, and they may think that the local bureaucracy is useless. But this man, he is a leader, he can solve my problem. And of course, it's a little bit ridiculous thinking that, the president can go and resolve every little problem there is, because that's why you have local governments at various levels. But that is the perception,
at least
right?
The problem is being addressed.
Of course, but that is the perception, right? And this is why these televised call-ins and readings of letters are so popular. Is because well, obviously there is that this idea, you could say, well, there's that propaganda aspect where it shows that yes, issues are being solved, yes, he is accessible to the people, but if problems weren't getting solved and he weren't accessible to the people, right? I mean, you can kind of look at the other side of the coin. But yeah, there is this perception of, kind of like when I said in 1905, the worker protesters perceived the Tsar as their father that would really listen to their petition, it would help them, and then their hopes were dashed. Much like here, they kind of perceive, again, not out of some nostalgia for a Tsar, but here is a real leader. He is actually capable of solving this issue that I have, whereas my local bureaucrat who's, who is just there sitting on a chair, we could put any other guy on this chair, it's going to be the same thing, isn't solving my issue, right? So I think it's kind of, maybe roughly speaking, the same perception. It's not so much the nostalgia for a monarchy. It's more about competent but also strong leadership. And in the West, you're not allowed to speak about strong leadership, because all of a sudden, like, you're this, you're that, you subscribe to, this kind of ideology that's outdated. Yeah, it's really kind of funny. But I think these labor protests are kind of interesting, because even just the idea of using bloody and then a day, if you look at history of labor protests in different countries, so for instance, the US has a Bloody Thursday from from 1934. And this was a strike by dock workers on the West Coast. And it escalated to the point where it resulted on deaths, in deaths of a couple of dock workers. So the numbers were, not as significant as in the Russian Bloody Sunday. But again, I think it's interesting that the monikers are even similar in terms of labor history. And so the result of this particular protest that kind of had a larger, the Bloody Thursday situation was a single event, but it was basically this long West Coast strike of these dock workers. I think they were called like longshoremen. And the result was the unionization of ports in the entire West Coast. So in this sense, you could say that that particular strike, which was significant, was a success, right? Because partial success, at least, right? If they achieved the ability to unionize, right? And in some situations, here the strike got violent. I think in U.S. history, let me check the date, in 1914. Yeah, so there was the Ludlow Massacre, which resulted from what was called the Colorado Coalfield War, which was basically just a big uprising of workers. And so the death toll here was in the dozens. So it was more significant. And so here it's, you could say maybe government inaction, but it's sort of more specific to the sort of the private corporations that the workers were protesting against, because it was the private guards that ended up cracking down on these protesters. So this is what I meant when I discussed sort of the protesters are not necessarily challenging the state, although you could say ultimately they may be. They also may be challenging a business, right, or a large corporation to achieve some kind of a goal. So, again, this is an example of the United States in the early 20th century, a democratic society, and yet you have situations like this, right? You have extreme violence in the context of workers trying to gain greater, rights for themselves. So I think lots of countries, like I said, that were industrialized or industrializing probably have, events like this. Even countries that are nominally democratic, there is just this really, really rough crackdown on them. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that it's always about the tune, the perception also from the oligarchy about the insatisfaction of the people. So, and I think that's brings me back to
the financial elites are sometimes left out of the. I mean, obviously there could be an overlap between political power and the financial elites, right? But sometimes they're sort of left out of this equation of we're only looking at the role of the state, and I think that might be a little too narrow. So
yeah, one of the things that we discuss sometimes with some Portuguese fellows here is that, for example, the Portuguese crown was much more astute than the British crown to understand the tune of the temper of the people. So when people were getting too agitated, they were dropping down a little bit. So
we're going to cut your tax by 0.5%.
Whatever, but people, would see this as a good thing. We had the independence of Brazil. We didn't have a war of independence. The monarch, the emperor, the son of the emperor, just
advocated.
Took out his sword and said, independence or death, which is probably the most stupid thing ever, because death against whom? Against the monarchy? That's you.
Right.
So
by the way,
yeah. So no, it's true, because the guy, which was the son of the emperor of Portugal, just become the emperor of Brazil.
Right.
So it's a coup d'etat against his father, but
ultimately
the business is a transaction of business, family business.
Same family, yeah.
Yeah. So they had, and there was a sentence of his advisor back at the time that said, you should do this. You should declare Brazil independence before some adventure does it.
Oh, because yes, yeah.
Because someone else would do.
Punch. Yeah. And then you get to keep power instead of being possibly beheaded and overthrown and
And
having
overthrown
very
and
having bad things happen to you. Yeah, that's
or a
definitely
civil war.
shrewd. Definitely shrewd. Yeah.
The same thing with the abortion of slavery in Brazil.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
the daughter of the emperor who signed the law, the Oria law, which is called, was signed by the princess. And, 10 years later, 10, 20 years later, they had a coup d'etat to become a republic from the army. From a general that was a friend of the imperial family. So, when you see this, okay, probably all of that was orchestrated before it happened. So we didn't have a civil war for slavery abortion. We didn't have a civil war to take down the monarchy and become a republic. Everything was very well tuned. And why do I mention all of that? Because I think that when we have a real revolution, like the Russian Revolution, Soviet Revolution, is the moment where the monarchy or the ruling class misses the tune of the temper of the people.
For decades, it's just kind of remarkable how you just keep missing and missing, and maybe there's like a little bit of a band-aid solution. And again, I understand we're looking at it in hindsight. We have better ways to analyze it now that we're removed from it by more than 100 years. But nonetheless, you should have some hopefully intelligent people in power as your ministers, as your advisors, who, and some of them would tell them these things. But yeah, it's interesting again how something that possibly could have been resolved was not, and it festered and it turned into essentially having this government fully lose this power forever, basically. Not as we'll just get a new guy from the same family, right? We'll just have some duke come in and take over. Yeah, so it's definitely interesting. It's just this idea that a failure can turn into such a success from the standpoint of the protesters, and I don't think those protesters at that time wanted the Tsar not to be in power, right? They still perceived him as their father that would solve their problems for a time. So the other case of, it's kind of hard not to mention when we're talking about anti-war protests, right? We briefly mentioned the ones that are going on now. We mentioned Iraq protests, right, that were just over 20 years ago that were quite massive. And, I don't want to get into them, but you could say they were kind of a failure because that had absolutely no impact on policy, right? It had some impact on public opinion, which is, of course, what happens a lot with these situations. But the one that we always go back to in terms of anti-war protests is the Vietnam era protests, right, in the United States. And there, of course,
those hippies.
They were all hippies. And so, those were, first of all, they took a long time. Like they went on for a while, from 1965 to 1973, when the treaty was signed, and essentially, North Americans don't like to think about it as a North Vietnamese victory, but really that's what it was. And so they were sort of, again, as these protests go, there was a lot of things going on, right? In the US, this was an era of the civil rights movement, sort of nascent second wave feminism, even a little bit of sort of like when you mention hippies, a little bit of kind of environmental awareness. If you think about, governments like to celebrate Earth Day. I'm pretty sure it was launched in like 1970, so kind of in that same period. I might be off on the date by a couple of years, but around that same time. So you had civil rights, you had women's movement, you had environmentalism, again, very roughly speaking. And so all of those things, they're not disconnected from each other. They kind of flow from each other. But there were sort of more practical, more specific reasons for the protests, right? Because at this time, the United States had the draft, right? So lots of people opposed conscription into the army and having to fly half the world away fighting for God knows what, right? So officially, remember, at this time in the context of the Cold War, there was that domino theory that if one state falls to evil communism, then all the other states would fall to communism. Therefore, the battle against communism was global. And of course, the United States is one of the two superpowers that came out of World War II took on that role, right? It decided that it was up to the United States to fight communism all over the world, right? This sort of initially started as the Truman Doctrine, and it sort of transformed a little bit. And so basically, this idea completely disregarded decolonization, right? That was going on in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in other parts of the world that were controlled by the European empires. And instead of perceiving these as sort of more national fights for independence, that may be a little bit, it might be a bumpy ride. The United States was perceiving them as, oh no, now the communists will come here and we will no longer be in charge of this place that is actually half the world away from us, which, today sounds much like before. It sounds a little bit crazy to me. And so, so you had opposition to conscription, right, of sending young American men to fight in this pointless conflict. And you obviously had, much like today, you had university campuses, right? Students are activists. If you go back to the late 19th century Russia, a lot of the opposition to the Russian autocracy and that form of government also took place on campuses in St. Petersburg, for instance, right? So even if you go and you read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, right? The main protagonist, or I guess he's like a bad character, he is a student, right? He's sort of like a failed student, and he has these particular ideas, right? So he was kind of associated with that intellectual movement as well. So it's nothing new to have students who are supposed to be gaining new knowledge. These days, it might be quite ideological, quite limited in some ways. It's nothing new for young people, right, to be involved in some kind of a movement, right? And it's nothing new for them to be intellectually excited, right, about whatever idea. And so, the fact that some of these Vietnam protests took place on campuses and some of them got violent, right, in terms of the crackdown, this is nothing new. And so the other really major thing with those protests was the sheer amount of media coverage. I mean, it's not to say that, if you think about World War II, it's not like it didn't have media coverage, but you had more immediate media coverage. This sounds like a tongue twister in the 1960s, right? Going to the early 1970s compared to 2 to 3 decades prior, right? And so, but of course, if we were comparing Vietnam era to today, where we have people dumping stuff on social media all the time, right? It's much, much more developed than that. But think of that as a similar idea, right? A similar concept where having access to more information and more imagery allowed people to form certain opinions, right? And then, of course, you could say because these were a lot of the protests were students, right? And they were intellectual, or they tried to be intellectually rigorous. You could say that they're also interested in just general questions of ethics and morality, right? Is this a justified war, right? Sometimes you can make an argument for a just war, and this was not one of them. So in terms of impact, again, this is something that is still being debated today. You can certainly claim that it changed public opinion, but I don't think it was these protests by themselves that changed public opinion. It's almost like the media coverage that everyone had access to, you could argue, changed public opinion. But in terms of policy, this was, I know some intellectuals claim that the policy, perhaps fewer soldiers being sent to Southeast Asia in the late 60s and early 70s might have been an outcome, but other thinkers would argue against that and just say this was more the result of basically the failure of, fighting in a war that was unwinnable. And so, I would just say it's almost like this is one of these protests that lasted for a really long time and had more maybe of a cultural impact, in terms of rather than meeting the goals of the protest, right? So in terms of, challenging the draft, completely ending the war. I mean, yes, ultimately the war did end, but I don't think it was, in my opinion, I don't think it was the result of the protest. So I don't know if this is something you've ever looked into, but what is sort of your hunch just by maybe knowing a little bit about that situation? I don't know how far in history you've gone down.
So yeah, just yesterday we talked about that in our channel, and we have a couple of opinions of ways that we are looking at this. So first of all this that we mentioned before in the last hour, it brings me to think that such a big, and you mentioned something very important, that is the media coverage, which is very high at this moment. So two things that we come to think about, and not to conclude, but to think about, is that, well, one of the possibilities is that, so the government is seeing that the battles are being lost, that the war in the Middle Eastern is being lost. And I think it was Arnaud Bertrand yesterday that tweeted, so it was not the Houthis, but the students who understood that why America does not have free healthcare. And I think that is one of the points that we made yesterday. So this war is being lost. And as a good comparison with Vietnam, the war was being lost and they needed a way out.
I mean, it was an absolutely insane situation, because remember, they were just carpet bombing them. And not just Vietnam, right? It was like Cambodia, Laos. Yeah. It was, and having this insane technology and still losing a war. I mean, this was really, I think, shocking to people who were in charge and who thought they could win this with technology, right? They came out of World War II with the bomb that they successfully tested, big air quotes, on the Japanese, on 2 Japanese cities, right? So here they have all this technology and they're fighting essentially against, peasants, well-organized peasants,
like the Houthis.
Not only, right? And so again, we can make a comparison to Afghanistan, right? And they're still losing this war. So I think, at some point there was this realization that, I think the American involvement in Vietnam is a very complicated issue, because remember, initially it was like only the advisors, and then we're only going to support them in this way. Oh, okay, we're going to allow boots on the ground in a limited way. And now we're just in this full-scale war where we're just carpet bombing, entire villages. Yeah, so it was like gradual involvement. And at some point there had to have been a realization, even on the part of someone like Kissinger, that this is just never going to end. And this is just a black hole that's sucking in, the lives of American troops. Not that they were very concerned about the Vietnamese lives, but just again, from, we're always people.
Or the American troops.
Usually people think about their own first, right? It's kind of like with Ukraine. Oh no, we're sending them all this money and we have inflation. Meanwhile, there's like 500,000 people, right? 500,000 soldiers dead on the battlefield, or whatever the estimate is today. Yeah. So at some point there was a realization in, the highest levels of power that this is just never going to end. Like this could be, and this is why they later then referred to Afghanistan as being the longest conflict since Vietnam, for instance. And so, it's so in this sense, I mean, I guess you can make an argument that, I would still have a hard time making the argument that the student protest, it wasn't just the students, obviously, it was people coming from different walks of life, but just that this organized anti-war movement had much of an impact on the decision making. It was more about.
No, but that's the point that I'm making. It's the point, I think, of the tweet from Arnaud Bertrand is that, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, everybody else in Iran, everybody else in the region are fighting. Whatever Israel is doing, but now the students are saving Gaza. you know,
Right.
because
Yeah.
the Western need to say, well, if it were not from the students from Sorbonne or
Mhm.
Michigan, whatever,
Mhm.
Western university, there would still be war. So one of the points that we made was that maybe they are trying to pave a way out
Mhm.
of this conflict, of
Mhm.
this idea, and they need to propagandize that the students did it. The Western, not the Western, the garden students
The
did it.
garden, yes, the
The
garden.
garden
Yeah,
students did it.
it's possible. I
And
mean, this could be like a way to reframe the situation and sell it to the masses, certainly. But speaking about
and
again, maybe not these particular students, but student protesters in general, you could say they're also using the best means that they have. It's not like they're limited in what they do. So, but yeah, generally, I think in these situations, it's not so much. Yes, public opinion is certainly impacted, but public opinion is impacted by other things like media access, right? The more media access there is, social media access, yes, it's completely imperfect. Some people do not have a way to, even people who are very smart and savvy when it comes to understanding these conflicts, they may not have a way of really analyzing every single thing that comes out and say, yes, this is legitimate. Sometimes, yes, there's a way to identify right where this came from and what it is, but not always. And so, nonetheless, even if it's completely imperfect, just having that amount of information and having the sheer scale of destruction, right, visible, whether it was in Vietnam after 1965 or today with the Middle East, definitely that might have more of an impact, right, than it's like that's what impacted the students in the first place, right? That's the thing. It was the media before they started protesting. Well, most of them, right? Of course, there are some ideological people that are intellectuals and maybe or just interested in politics and they know
yeah,
about that
we've been
in more detail, but not all of them, not most of them, I would say.
seeing protests from students since day one of the Gaza problem
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
Israel, since day one. But you see on Telegram channels, you see on Twitter from
Hmm.
sources like your tweet account or some other people tweet, not from CNN, not from BBC or whatever
Hmm.
Western mainstream media of mass destruction. So and I think your point is exactly right. I mean, the media started to pump gasoline in a small fire, and
Hmm.
then the fire becomes larger, and then the
Of course.
politicians, but the media is controlled by the politicians. So you
Yes.
cannot say that this, again, it's not organic. So the
Hmm.
politicians themselves or the oligarchs behind the politicians, they say, okay, we need to, flame up a little bit so that the political system can feel the temperature is going up and start to take measures to bring it
Right.
back down, and measures to bring it back down is not, arresting protesters or
Right.
doing whatever Europe is
See, we
doing
started
to
we
the people.
started this episode with fire, and we're ending it with media sort of fanning the flames of more figuratively speaking. But this is kind of a good way
Exactly.
to wrap up the idea. But I think if we were to look at these, just very different examples that we looked at today, and again, we could have chosen other examples because they're, we kind of focused on the things that I know, but we could have
Mhm.
focused on, 1968 in Europe, 1848 in Europe, right? We could have taken other protests as well. I think if sort of we had to analyze them all together, it's a very diverse picture, right? And in some cases, it was a complete failure in terms of meeting the goals, but ultimately it led to the toppling of, the Russian imperial government. In other cases, there might have been a little bit of um, of progress made in terms of like, okay, the workers now can unionize, or the workers have a little bit of a better pay, for instance, right? But nothing really fundamental changed. So I think the idea here, again, is that even if these things have leaders, even if they have very distinct ideas, even if they're well organized, even if they're, you could claim they're in the right to be protesting, the end result is, remains to be seen if it's still ongoing. It's just very difficult to conclude. And like there's still debates about, if there's still debates about Vietnam or 1905 in Russia, then there's certainly going to be debates about the Iraq War protests or the current anti-war protests that we're seeing today. But it's still, even if they don't have the impact that they desire to, I think they're still significant because of the sheer scale, right? So definitely an interesting situation, I think, for the state, where the state has to, again, nominally democratic states have to say, yes, 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 of course we love our civil society. Of course they can come and express their opinions as long as they don't challenge us in any shape or form, and then we'll crack down on them. Yeah, so it really does, I think, also show the power of the state. I think a libertarian will be, or an anarchist will be, see, the state is always bad. Look at what they do. I am definitely, in my forlorn days of my youth, I might have claimed to be a libertarian. Definitely not now. I definitely think the state is absolutely necessary. But you can also say sometimes the state is generally good, and sometimes the state is generally bad, right? And of course, the state can totally overstep, past the powers that it should have to protect itself, because ultimately the state is interested in its own survival rather than any of its subjects' ability to, express his or her views. Like, who cares about that? It's about the state's survival, which of course, then leads to questions of social stability and chaos. And yes, most people like stability, like you said, right? So there's also that limit where why people would side with ultimately the state, even if they may consider a certain protest legitimate. But that could be a question for another episode. So I think we're going to wrap this one up now. We started with a very sad topic. And we ended on, I guess, kind of a more maybe milder note.
Hopeful, at least.
Hopeful, a little bit hopeful. Yeah, so hopefully I would love to hear, especially if some of you guys are from countries that were not mentioned or are way outside of my self-proclaimed expertise, or maybe I do have a little bit of an expertise. I would love to hear your opinion and maybe some examples of maybe protests in your country, or especially maybe historic examples from long ago, because those are more interesting because there's less documentation of them and there may be more debate about them. So I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for doing the technical part, Marcelo. And
don't forget to like, share, subscribe if you like. If you don't like, just don't like.
But come and insult us our ideologies, and every episode was going to be like a different ideology, right? Well, today you're a communist, but yesterday you were a libertarian. It's like, no, I'm the same person with the same opinions. So
if you think I'm too liberal, please remember to send a super chat. Okay, so I allow you to say that if you pay for. If you want to fund or help funding this work, you have the link of Nina's Buy Me a Coffee there. And in our channel, you can send a super like. I don't know how's it called in English. Super like.
I think it's a super. Yeah, I think it's like a. Yeah, I think it's a super like or
it's
something.
It's a super cool super like. It's the heart with money on it. So
heart with money.
Yeah, heart is money. Oh yeah. Oh, that's a Mexican. You would.
Thank you, Google. Thank you, Google. Thank you, YouTube. Yeah, but thank you for watching, and we will see you in just a few days. Bye.
See you. Bye bye.